glad to have another chance to have a conversation with another leader in our community. Today it's with Rachel Ambasing from St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in National City.
Yay.
Rachel, really glad to have a chance to chat with you. Sounds like you've watched a few of these other conversations, so thanks for doing that. And usually we just first give folks a chance to introduce themselves, and maybe I could also ask you, as you're introducing yourself, why you were interested in having this conversation today.
Okay, well, hello. My name is Rachel Ambasing. Why was I interested? I feel like recently, in 2020, like post-COVID, or during COVID, I feel like I've been like hibernating a lot, like almost in a cocoon. So I have this thing I've been doing where I try to make myself uncomfortable in order to grow, and I'm highly uncomfortable right now. And if it comes from if it comes from a person who it seems like is trustworthy, then I think it makes it a little bit easier. So, and this is an important conversation to have, really, or an important conversation to keep going. I have a lot of friends on Instagram who are posting a lot about how, this movement or this moment it's more than just a trend. It's more than, it doesn't take only a month to dismantle systemic racism. So, it for sure is an important conversation. I'm thankful that you are giving a platform to people of color within the diocese to share their thoughts, because one of the reasons I stumbled upon your series in the first place was because I shared with one of my friends that I was like really frustrated with the lack of diversity that it seemed like there was online. Just like the lack of representation. I think it was after Pentecost, actually, because I had just gotten done with Zoom service at St. Matthew's, and then that was nice because it's a very, very, very Filipino heavy community at St. Matthew's. And then that was nice. And we closed with How Great Thou Art in 3 languages. We did English, Spanish, and an old Filipino dialect. And because I know like Pentecost is usually the day we celebrate like speaking in different tongues. And I know at St. Philip's, my dad had to leave the St. Matthew's Zoom service early so he can, I think he read the Psalm in Tagalog, because Father Carlos made sure to include as many languages as possible into his service. And I'm like, dude, this is like so awesome. Like, look at all these multicultural things that are happening within the diocese. And then I go online to like see what services I can kind of see. And then everything that was featured was just, it was very white, which is fine. That's like the Episcopal Church is very white. It's 90% white. But I think I was just frustrated during that moment because it was the same weekend or around the same weekend that George Floyd's death happened, and that protesting was really like picking up. And I think I just felt like not represented, I guess. So, so I expressed those frustrations with one of my friends. And then she pointed me in the direction of your series. And I think you had just come out with a couple of episodes or a couple of installments, whatever you want to call it. And I was like, this is fantastic, because I'm used to St. Luke's being featured like with your choir. So I get to see some people from your congregation singing. Just like I see like the dancers from the Aztec dancers from St. Philip's, they're usually featured too, but very rarely do I feel like I get to hear the voices from these people or like hear about their experiences and that kind of thing. So while it's great to hear people sing, it's really great to hear praise songs in Swahili, and it's really beautiful to see the Aztec dancers. It is important too, I think, to be able to feature other people's experiences and to hear them read the Word of God in their own voices.
Thank you. What would you be willing to share about your own racial identity and how it shaped who you are, and maybe even who you are as a Christian?
Okay, well, one of the biggest challenges that I've faced in my life is I'm Filipino and Chinese, and my grandpa on my mother's side he was Buddhist, but I make the joke that he could be Buddhist still because they believe in reincarnation. So who knows, he might have been reincarnated as a Buddhist again.
Okay.
So he was Buddhist, and I remember I went to the funeral, it was like the first time I had ever seen like Buddhist rituals, and that was kind of cool now that I think about it. Because how many Christians can say that they've experienced like a Buddhist ceremony? Mm-hmm. But anyway, at that time, I was used to like the really, really narrow viewpoint that if you were not a Christian in name, if you're not Christian identifying, like you're going to go to hell. So, you know, like for the most part, like my grandpa, he was human, but I thought that he was a pretty good person. So it was just hard for me to believe that just because he had been raised in a different place and that Buddhism was more accessible to him, that just because of that, he was doomed to eternal hell. Yeah. So I think that has shaped me a lot too. And I've also realized I'm kind of sensitive to the theme of colonialism. I shared this story recently within Cursillo, but my grandpa on my dad's side, he was the first in his family to convert to Christianity. Before then, the family worshipped a Filipino god, like an old Filipino god called Kabuyan. And then Episcopal missionaries came to the Philippines and started kind of dialoguing with them, and they were able to find like similarities between Kabuyan, like you guys call him Kabuyan, but like, you know, we call him God. So, and like that kind of thing, and taught him about Jesus. But before I knew that that was the story of conversion within my family, I read like this really hard, difficult, but really beautiful book called Things Fall Apart in high school. And I feel like high school is where most Christians really reach their first existential crisis, because you hear about like all these terrible things that happened in history. But yeah, we read this book called Things Fall Apart, and it was a story about a man who loses his life, and a village and a tribe that loses their way of life because missionaries came over basically and were like, okay, you guys, this is the way that you guys need to live. This is the God that you need to worship. If you can't fall in line with this, then like you're dead, basically. So having to reconcile like with those two things, with colonialism and with different world religions, I think it's given me more of an open mind. Maybe, I don't know. I think I'm more comfortable saying that I don't know what the truth is than a lot of other, maybe than other people who haven't had those experiences in their family history, because I know that God is the truth, and I know that God is love, but I feel like sometimes he gets packaged so small, like there can only be one true way to worship God, but we're talking about the God who is also like three different beings, like the 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, like that in itself, like logically is it doesn't make sense. So how can we, you know what I mean? It doesn't, like what? So, you know, if we're talking about this God who is so awesome and can make sense of things that don't make sense, like maybe he can be the truth, but also the truth is a lot bigger than we would like to think it is. What am I even babbling about? This is very uncomfortable.
It's not babbling, and it's great. And actually, what you were saying made me think. I had almost asked you before, why do you think our diocese, which is in a place that is so diverse, is so white? And then I thought, oh, that might not be a fair question. So I'll at least give you my take on that, because it reminds me of what you're saying, which is that I think it's hard for us to see as Episcopalians that the way we worship is very Anglican, which of course it's the Anglican Church. Like, it's not a surprise. Like, it came from the Church of England, like people who like organs and really structured liturgy and all these other assumptions that we make, that we just think like that's just church, you know, but it's not the way that people worship around the world. You know, it's one way, and it's a great way for people, but it's not going to speak to everybody. And I think that it's not then a surprise that we can say how welcoming we are, but it's just not the way that many people interact with their God, you know? And I think until we start to come to a greater sense of awareness and humility around like how specific a cultural sort of investment we've made in how we worship God, then it's going to be hard for us to really be effective in reaching out to other as equally valid, culturally specific ways of worshiping, still within like a Christian framework. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I think that's something that we struggle with at St. Luke's. We struggle with in every church, I would imagine, the diocese in some way, just trying to figure out like, why are we so white, you know? And there's some obstacles there.
I've had like many conversations with some of my closer friends and even with my brother too, because right, we know like people of color exist in our diocese, but one of the things that came up was that maybe it's like people are just worried about their accents, and then sometimes that's why they don't step up to be more vocal about sharing their experiences, or even wanting to read, right? Wanting to read on video with a thick accent. If, like in the US, there are accents which we find very charming, like British accent, and they're at the same time, they're, for some reason, if people have accents from different parts of the world, they tend to be looked down on a little bit. And then one of the other things that me and my brother were thinking that it could be too, I shouldn't keep bringing my brother into this because I don't want to bring him down with me just in case.
Give him a call. Let's bring him into the conversation.
Just FYI, I said this. But we were wondering if maybe it has to do with like the cultural structure of some cultures, because like in our Filipino culture, we are from like Igorot tribes, and I'm butchering that word. I'm so sorry to my ancestors, but like we're from a people who are like from the mountain provinces of the Philippines, where like a tribal kind of structure is historically what we followed. So so the hypothesis is that we're used to following only one person. So like the chief of the tribes, which in church, I guess, would kind of translate to the priest. So, but I guess that can lend itself to the question, like, why aren't there more clergy who are not white? But I guess from like a lay perspective, like maybe that's another reason why people of color are not as visible, because they're culturally, it might be ingrained in them to just let the priest, who happens to be white, speak for them or do the talking. I don't know. I didn't study any of this. That's just late night thoughts from somebody who grew up here.
One reason just that St. Luke's, again, we've had folks over the years express interest in beginning the discernment process about becoming clergy, and a lot of them have been stuck on the fact that their education that they received in refugee camps or in Sudan didn't translate in an official and formal way into like a bachelor's degree, for example. And that's just has always been a minimum requirement to start the process. You have to have graduated from college. And so we haven't been able to figure out at times in the past about how to even make those sort of translations. And so that's a very real obstacle. And again, it's like, that's a reasonable expectation. People should graduate college before they, start being a priest. But then like to be able to not adapt it means that then you end up with a less diverse clergy. So, there has to be there's reasonable rules, but then like we have to think about being more flexible, I think. So
that's interesting. I didn't know that. I have to write that down. Also, I need to throw it back to, I'm using the phrase people who like organs now, like to describe kind of, I love organ music though, I have to say. Yeah. Like when I was growing up I did grow up in the Episcopal Church. I was baptized at Good Shepherd Benita before my family headed over to St. Matthew's. Yeah. But I also sang in the St. Cecilia choir at St. Paul's, like around 1995-ish. Nice. But yeah, I love some organ music, and Filipinos love chanting. Like the school that my dad grew up in, they had sung mass, I think, like every single day. And we recently visited All Saints in, I think it's All Saints. Yeah, All Saints in, I don't know where it is. I don't know my San Diego geography. I think it's North Park, maybe somewhere. Okay, yeah. The one close to downtown. Anyway, and they had their Sung Right One Mass, and I was just so shocked. Like my dad and one of my uncles, they were just singing the Nicene Creed. Like they didn't even have to open up the 1941 hymnal. They just sung it off the top of their heads, and it's insanely complicated. So like I was looking at the notes and I'm like, dang, how did you remember this? But what is my point in all this? Oh, it just shocks me how traditional they are. Like even though they came, like it shocks me how traditional some like the Filipino church is sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and you can't make assumptions that any people group would particularly like. And obviously, I mean, I'm not a huge organ guy myself, so. So what looking at in the last 4 months, the increased attention finally to what's happening with Black Lives Matter, how have you been thinking personally about how to get involved? Like, I don't know if you've gone to protests, have you given money, have you, is there things in your social media spaces that you've been thinking about? Like, how have you thought about contributing, and maybe why, or I don't know.
Really great question. My social media space is definitely a lot different, I think. Well, first of all, I've been posting less because I think maybe to make room for the discomfort. Like after all of that happened, like I kind of don't want to go back to the way it was before, where everyone's okay with just posting like really vapid selfies or just reposting like recipes from Tasty that don't even turn out well. Yeah. I want to leave the space for the reading lists of books from different authors, or the different mental health tips that are being more publicized now from people of color. I don't want to go back to the way it was before, and I think that's because people are starting to finally have these conversations. And I remember like back when the Ferguson protests were happening in like 2014, I remember there was a lot more pushback from non-Black people of color. Like when Black Lives Matter was first happening, a lot of non-Black people of color would push back and say all lives matter, right? Whereas now in 2020, like so many more people are on board, and with the idea that if all lives mattered, we wouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. Yeah. But I remember in like back then, there were way more non-Black people of color who were saying all lives matter. And I think maybe the difference is that in 2020, there's been a lot more reporting of other racially charged incidents or other cases of discrimination against different minority groups that have been happening, whether it's against Asian Americans because people are scared that all Asians are Chinese and have COVID, or Latinx children being locked up in cages at the border. There's a lot there's a lot going on that kind of stems from white supremacy. And I think before, maybe in 2014, a lot of people didn't realize that even though injustices happen to people of all groups, it's all interconnected. Like if there are white people who feel, or just people, if there are people who feel comfortable oppressing Black people, that also means that they feel comfortable oppressing others. And also, the hatred that is experienced by Black people, of course, that's going to be extended in different ways. And the reason I say this is because in San Francisco, I lived in San Francisco, and there's a lot of racial tension that happens in certain areas of San Francisco that doesn't get covered by the media a lot. There are certain areas of town where it's been documented that there are older, typically Chinese immigrants live in these areas that were historically made up by Black communities, and they're poor communities. So in these communities, were higher incidents of violence from typically younger Black men to older Asian men. And for some reason, the media is very uncomfortable with minority on minority violence. And recently in 2020, there were a lot more videos that went viral that kind of documented that same kind of tension. And I remember when I first learned about it, I was like really upset because how do I want to say this? Because like, how do you for some reason, we expect people who have been hurt to automatically be able to empathize or to show empathy to others and not redistribute that pain, I guess. Like, we expect them to like overcome that hurt and to just automatically be the bigger person, right? When it's like, the reality is if you are given like a small piece of the pie and then all of a sudden somebody else comes after your pie, you're gonna fight like crazy because that's all you have. So, oh my God, what was my point in this? Oh, okay. So one day I remember I was coming home from work. I was at the Muni Station in San Francisco, and I actually got to witness an incident where all of a sudden I heard like just a woman with a Chinese accent like screaming, and I was like, dang, like what's wrong with this? I'm tired, like I just want to go home, like why is this chick screaming? So I look over, and then she's carrying like her adult son in her arms, but he's like just bleeding from the face. And then a couple of Black guys just brushed past me, like they pushed my shoulder and they just ran up the stairs. And I got close and I was like, what happened? And then somebody told me like that the dudes that just brushed past me had just punched the dude in the face. Like they called him a Chinese MFer and then spit on him and then punched him like really hard, and then ran up the steps. And I remember getting home and just being like so overwhelmed with just a feeling of why does that happen, you know? But I think that night was like the first time that I ever prayed in a way where I was like connecting with God rather than be talking to God, like asking him for a laundry list of what I wanted. It was more like a two-way thing, because at first I wanted to pray for justice to be done, right? I wanted to pray for like these men to be caught and for them to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But then I remember having a moment like, well, what good does that do? Because if that's all, if they're essentially fighting for space, if their hurt is coming from not having space and from being oppressed, and if they're only oppressing others because they themselves have been oppressed, then what is oppressing them more going to do? Like, clearly we don't want to enable people who act violently, but at the same time, like 2 more Black men in jail, like that doesn't help. That probably hurts more than it heals, and they'll probably come out of jail being even more angry at the Asian community for their incarceration. So it was a really deep prayer moment, I think, for me, but just a realization that the hurt that affects one community really affects all of us. And I think that is something that makes 2020 way different from 2014, is that more people are realizing that the oppression of one group isn't just about that one group. Like, it affects, like, it'll seep its way into like every single other group in this country. And it's that same, like, hurt people. So I don't know how I got here from your initial question, which was what I've been doing for the Black Lives Matter movement. But anyway, I'm glad I said what I said. So
me too. Thank you. And I love that you at such a pained moment, like, reached out to God and tried in prayer to like see how God saw what had happened, you know, and to make that sort of leap to seeing how pain and suffering can be shared, both in like good ways and bad, right? Because solidarity is just another way of sharing people's suffering, but then violence is its own, often, you know, is just coming. It's just this cycle too, right? That like is connected to previous pain and violence and suffering, and to see how we're interconnected. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I do think God gives us those insights because they're not they're not the natural kind of human response, I don't think, you know, like the natural human response is to note what those people looked like, those people, and to make sure that like at the very least, you know, like those people could hurt you in the future, but like at the worst, like I'm going to get those people back. And that's what creates like this other pandemic we've been facing for hundreds of years, you know, if not thousands, as humans, right? Like humans are quite creative in finding ways to categorize and label people so that those in power can maintain the power, the rest can you know, stay stuck. And in America, we've created quite sophisticated system based on how people appear, you know, to make sure that those in power get to keep that power. But humans have figured out other ways to do that in other places for a long time. But thank you for sharing that story. Where do we go from here? Like, is there a cause for hope? Is this, you keep mentioning 2020 is different. Is there some reason now to think that we're moving in a direction that we haven't before?
Well, a lot of people are thinking that it's going to be that 2020 is different because a lot more people have the time to sit and think about this kind of stuff, or not even have the time, or like forced to have the time because we can't go anywhere without well, for me, I feel terrified to go anywhere because I'm a mad hypochondriac, but some people just legally aren't allowed to go anywhere right now. So maybe, but it could also be that we could return to normal because there are so many distractions out there. Like it's for every one person who's still continuing to post about social justice, I think there are others who are kind of reverting back to the old game. But then again, it's really unfair of me to be judging anybody based off of their social media feed, because they could be posting a picture of their brunch, but at the same time, they could also be they could be on their way to a Black Lives Matter march as they're posting. Like that could be the brunch that they eat right before they head off to the protest. So who knows? But I think the amount of uncomfortable conversations I've seen people be willing to have is pretty miraculous. And I think that makes me hopeful too. Even within the Episcopal Church, I've been so shocked. There's a pretty big church in the diocese, and again, I won't mention them because I don't want to drag them down just in case. But in this case, I feel like it's such a good thing. But I was so shocked when I saw that they had a litany that was geared towards race and reconciliation. And I think that gave me more of an appreciation for some of the bigger churches, since St. Matthew's is kind of a smaller church. And I always thought that maybe small churches had more problems because we always have to worry about money. But I'm realizing too that this big church that had that service, I was so shocked because a couple of days before they had posted up, or their pastor had posted up something about something that was going on politically in the world. And for every comment that was like, thank you for posting this, there were also comments that were like, okay, like this is not why I go to this parish. Like we need to keep politics out of religion. Like I think I need to find another church. And I was like, dang, like at bigger churches, I assume that there's a pressure to keep every single one of your congregants happy, and that's impossible to do. You really can't please everyone. So yeah, that the fact that so many people are willing to go maybe the unpopular route, definitely the uncomfortable route is helpful to me. Although I will say, I hope nobody feels alienated off of some churches willing to take on more controversial subjects. But maybe that's not. Isn't there a part in Eucharistic Parousia where oh, it's been so long since I've had communion, so I don't remember what it is exactly, but like save us from the presumption of coming to this table for solace only and not for strength, or for pardon only and not for renewal, right? Like, yeah. So like, there's this presumption that that church is supposed to like make us feel better, when in actuality, church at its best, in my opinion, is supposed to just not make us feel better, but to make us better followers of Jesus. So, and that involves being highly uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I think.
Afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted.
Oh, I like that.
But it also makes sense that like you've had a hard week, there's lots of stresses in your life. Like the last thing you want to do is intentionally go to a place that's going to make you uncomfortable, right? Or intentionally go to a place that's going to try to change your life. Like, what if you think your life is not bad, right? And I mean, that's why I think privilege is one of the greatest obstacles to faith formation, right? Like if your good news is your current life, then why do you need God's good news, right? Especially if God's good news is going to start to undercut some of the assumptions you made about your own good news. So it's hard. It's really hard.
Oh my God, that's so good.
Yeah.
That reminds me of, I got to see the webinar given by Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Buttigieg?
Judge, I think.
Oh, thank you. And then he said something that I thought was really poignant. Like, the most threatening thing to people is the belief that they're not good or something like that, or that they're not, like, nobody wants to think that they're a bad person, or nobody wants to think that they're the bad guy in the story, right? So, how did I arrive here off of? Oh, but yeah, I think too that maybe part of wanting people to feel comfortable is not wanting to question where we've gone wrong in our own lives. Mm-hmm. So,
speaking of comfort, did you start to feel more comfortable, or are you still just as uncomfortable as when you started this conversation?
Oh, I'm still super uncomfortable, and I think even more uncomfortable now, because I'm like, oh no, like I didn't ask Father Colin any questions, and like some of my answers just completely went tangential and like didn't even answer any of his questions. And, you know, was my voice even, or is this going to be a shock to the viewer when there's like major lows and then like major high? I'm a Virgo, so it's that's the way I operate.
Well, as we think about closing, are there other things you wanted to talk about or wish we had talked about?
I want to ask you a question. So we talked a lot about me being uncomfortable. What was your most uncomfortable moment? Maybe doing the series, maybe in having these conversations for grace, race, or God, race, and grace? Or do you just go through life not being uncomfortable, or being comfortable with your discomfort?
I'm human, so I feel uncomfortable often. And I also don't like to feel uncomfortable, like I think most people. I do think these conversations have helped me with, I think, an important skill that we can all like practice building, which is that, yeah, some conversations are necessarily uncomfortable, and that's all right. Actually, if you're not feeling uncomfortable, then you're probably not really engaging with this topic, you know? And I think, yeah, discomfort is probably one of the biggest obstacles for many of us, especially white folks, to even starting the conversation. So to answer part of your question, I think the times I felt most uncomfortable in these conversations with another white person, and especially in kind of feeling their anxiety around not having all the right answers. Because I think there's this like sense, at least among some white folks, that like there is a set of right answers out there, and you know, maybe you should do some learning more first, but that there's some sort of way that you can just sort of say it all right. I suppose that's true. Like there's some concepts we can learn and in language that we could use that is helpful, but the answers are eventually lay claim to our own lives. And it's just, again, speaking as a white person, like it's going to be uncomfortable to recognize the ways that you've benefited from the system that have held others down, that have led to the deaths of people and incarceration of people over centuries. Like you're gonna feel bad about that, and that leads to paralysis, that leads to feeling overwhelmed. And again, for many white people, that it stops the conversation before it even starts, which is unfortunate. And that's part of what I've been hoping with some of these conversations, is just a model like that there aren't right answers. I think our prayer is just for some honest answers, and then to go from there, right? And that's where I think God's grace fits in, right? Because we're not going to get the answers right. The answers are going to change based on like the relationship that we're kind of engaging with, not because there's like one set of answers for one person and another for another, but because like the way that we relate to each other is shaped like specifically, and it starts by listening and learning and caring. And I don't know, I just think we're going to mess it up. Like humans just mess things up. But like, that's where I just think as a Christian, like, I'm just grateful that God really cares about this whole thing, and that God is just like shooting in grace all over the place, to kind of keep making our paltry sort of offerings like enough. Like that's all I keep praying for, is like, just make this enough, any particular interaction or conversation. And it's hard because it's not just good intentions. Good intentions aren't enough, so it's going to be a time where like, especially as a lot of people who haven't thought or had to, right? That's part of like white privilege, is not even having to like think about this stuff if we didn't want to. There's a lot of people that are like, oh man, I think I better start thinking about this stuff. And they're like at like level 1, and it's going to be hard for people who've had some more practice to be like gracious with them. But we all got to figure this out together. It goes back to what you're saying, like this is all interconnected, and we need white folks, we need everybody to like get on the team here. So it's going to take some graciousness, and we need God's help for that, because again, we're human, and it's hard to muster that graciousness, especially if you've been the victim of so much oppression. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but it was an attempt.
That also reminds me that I have yet to address the fact that I recognize that as an Asian person, I have more privilege than as an Asian American person. I have certain privileges that people who immigrated from Asia don't have, because I talk with a heavily Valley Girl accent as opposed to like a Filipino accent or a Chinese accent. And I have like, I didn't even address like the colorized privilege, the fact that if I walk into a really expensive store, I probably won't be profiled to the extent that a Black American might deal with. And that's like, but I also feel like I acknowledge that, but I also feel uncomfortable again talking about that further, because I don't feel like I know enough about it to say it. Like I know enough to acknowledge it and to recognize that I have that, but I don't know what any further steps are from that. Maybe to be on the lookout for that happening to people who might be facing that.
I think it's just helpful to come to greater awareness of our own privilege first, so that we can talk to other people who share the same relative privilege and help them notice it too. And then as everyone becomes more aware, we understand the systems behind it. And then the hardest part is the people with privilege, people with power, have to start finding ways to share their power, if not give up their power, with others. And that's the scariest part, right? Like, who wants to do that, So, but I think the first step is just to recognize you even are enjoying the privileges and go from there. But
I hope so. And I think too, like the amount of vulnerability it takes to have a conversation like this and to keep having conversations like this, and the amount of humility it takes to recognize where you've gone wrong in your life, and even where you might go wrong in a conversation like this. It's like those two things are hard, like vulnerability and humility. But I am thankful for the opportunity to have a conversation like this and to practice those two things.
Yeah, thank you. Courage is not that you don't feel fearful, it's that you feel fearful and you do it anyway. So I'm grateful for your courage today. And I think the fact that we feel uncomfortable means that we've got a moral compass still working inside that says what's happening isn't fair, and it's unjust. And so we're affirming that, and now we need to, as we start to recognize that, like figure out what to do about it. And God's walking with us along the way, and I'm grateful for that, and grateful for you and your time to share.
Thank you.
Can I ask you to say a final prayer for us?
Yeah, we can do that. Okay. Almighty God, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for the gift of technology and the gift of Zoom to be able to have conversations like this during this time. And thank you for Father Colin and for his mission in doing what he can to use his privilege and use his platform to amplify different voices who may not have had the chance before. Keep turning our hearts, God, and may we discern the path that you have for us to walk, and may we not shy away from any difficulties or any discomfort that we need to experience in order to be the people that you need us to be. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
And hey, thank you again. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course.